Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to be here today with Denise Kripper, editor of Latin American Literature Today. And also, Denise just had a baby, so I'm especially excited to welcome her and thank her for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Becky, so much. It's great to be here.
And where are you joining us from, actually?
I'm in Chicago right now.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, nice.
Yeah.
Great. So welcome everyone. As always, if you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I will work them into the discussion. So Denise, tell us about the origin of the magazine and then also when you came into it, were you there from the beginning? And if not, how did you get involved with the magazine? How did you meet the editors and so on?
Yeah. So Latin American Literature Today has been around for 6 years now. We started in 2017. Our parent publication is World Literature Today, based on the University of Oklahoma. And so we're like a sister publication in a way, specializing in Latin American literature. And the project really came from Marcelo Rios Seco, Arturo Gutierrez Plaza, Arthur Dixon, and George Henson, who was the original, the one and only translation editor before me. And they were really sort of, spearheading this project of, having a literary magazine devoted specifically not only to Latin American literature, but to Latin American literature in translation too. So the magazine is published bilingually. All of our contents are in Spanish and in English, and I should say multilingual actually, because we have specific sections that are also published in other original languages that are not Spanish, like our Brazilian section, Brazilian literature published in Portuguese, and our very important indigenous literature section, which is published in a wide variety of indigenous languages that are spoken throughout the continent. So I joined in 2019. And I had, met the editors in, literature events, and, we were sort of on the same page about the role that we wanted translation to have in the magazine. I'm forever grateful to both George Henson and Arthur Dixon, who had done such an amazing job with translation to begin with in the magazine. So sort of my job joining was just continuing on and building from what they have done. Creating more sections that relate to translation specifically, and to sort of amplify the voices of our various translations who work with us for every issue.
Sure, that's great. Thank you. So can you tell us the basics? The magazine publishes print and online. And what genres does the magazine publish?
Right. So at the moment, the magazine only print, or actually only is only online, I should say.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I mean that really gives us a lot of space to play around with different formats, videos, do it a more sort of interactive in ways that print magazines can't do. So, being online has been great for us. We do have plans moving forward to maybe have a print issue here and there, or to do an anthology. We really want to explore other options, but right now we're fully online. Like I was saying, you can see it's actually kind of like two magazines in one in a way, because you can see the entire contents of the magazine all in English, and then you can click a button and it looks like it's like magic, but it's actually a lot of work to have the whole magazine
Oh,
also
yeah.
in Spanish, right? So it's two magazines in one. We do 4 issues a year. And we have, several sections that sort of repeat every issue. We have interviews, we have essays, book reviews, and then we have at least 2 dossiers in every issue. We really try to work with sort of established authors, maybe authors that we're paying homage to. And then we have another dossier with sort of up-and-coming writers, emerging writers, voices that we want to amplify, maybe writers that are very well known in their home countries, but not extensively across the continent. So really we're sort of trying to play with those 2 ideas. The sections that I'm currently responsible for are specifically one called On Translation. And this is a new section that started when I joined, and it features interviews with translators, essays by translators, sort of reflecting on their work and the art of translation, really sort of peeking behind the curtain of what happens really in the magazine. Because like I said, you push you click on a button and everything changes language, but it's really not that easy. And we have a whole team of people working for that. So we really wanted to create a space for them to talk about how they're doing that, the decisions they're making, the things that they're thinking, considering when they translate. And we also have another section that actually publishes only in English because it's translation previews. And so this is the part where, new releases or recent releases are published, and we have like a little sneak peek of this new translation of a Latin American book that's coming out in the US. And, this is a space to really connect our readers who are interested in Latin American literature being published in English to, get a sense, get a feel for what's new, what's coming, the books that they can publish, that they can buy, purchase, and really get to know publishers, presses that are working with translations, that are interested, that are, have submission periods open for reading translations. And then, of course, we have like the core of the literature that we publish. It's fiction, prose, usually short stories, maybe the beginning, the opening of a novel, and then poetry as well. So really every issue, there's so much material, so much to go through, so much to read. And I feel like issues keep getting bigger, and I wonder how we're doing all this, because it's really amazing the amount of material that we're putting out every issue.
Yeah. So how do the translations work? Does a writer submit in whichever language they feel most comfortable in, and then you find an editor who is able to translate the piece, or what happens?
Right. So I guess it varies from, material to material. We get the literary submissions actually from translators themselves. So we're a magazine that I would say is pretty popular among translators because they can submit the materials directly to us. At the moment, although we have a huge group of translators working with us, we really don't have the capacity to commission translations, although it's something that we would love to do in the future as well. We don't have the power to commission literary translations, I should say. So we get those submissions for prose and poetry directly from translators themselves who are already working with those authors. Of course, they have to secure the rights and everything, but we work directly with the translators themselves. And this is something that I also really like, because I don't think of anyone better than translators themselves to scout the literature for us. Like, translators are so on top of what's being written, what's being read, what's being done in the continent, right? So I feel like we get a really well curated section by getting those submissions from translators themselves. Now, for the other materials, the interviews, sometimes the essays, the reviews, all the other things that we publish, we have a team of volunteer translators, and these are emerging translators. These are very established translators. We have a really good mix of people who work as translators, who are interested in getting into translation. We have a lot of students of translation that publish their first translations with us. So for that, I do commission the translators, the translations. And, sometimes we have a little back and forth. If I have edits, if there's students working with me, I try to give them feedback. There aren't many programs in the US that teach translation. So Latin American Literature Today also works as some sort of school for translation. So I try to give as much feedback as I can. For other pieces, I will just trust the translator that I commissioned the translation from. And we have such a good team that, translations are usually in really good hands. So I would, of course, review them and edit them as I feel the need to. But it would be a mix of receiving translations, literary translations from translators, and then our team commissioning from other translators that work with us.
And to clarify, do you accept work submitted in English by someone who doesn't have a translator working with them, or submitted in Spanish?
Yeah, so we sometimes get emails from authors, and I would say that we especially value the sort of collaborative work between an author and a translator. And so sometimes we will have bilingual authors who would be willing to do their own self-translations. And while I appreciate that, I really want authors to be working with translators. I feel like the experience of being translated can be very enriching for authors. So usually when that happens, I will try to pair them with a translator, like, browse our website, see who are the translators who are working with the type of authors that you think your literature is most similar to, or that you like the work that they're doing, and then I will put them in touch. So we've had a lot of partnerships and collaborations sort of born out of this hope for us for translators and authors to collaborate. So for literary work, if you're submitting prose or if you're submitting poetry, I would say it would be best to be paired with a translator already. If you're pitching an interview, an essay, a book review, those materials we will readily accept either in English or in Spanish or Portuguese, and then we will have that translated for you.
And you've actually written a book about translators in literature.
Yeah, that's coming out. Yeah, that's coming out in January of next year. It's called Narratives of Mistranslation, Fictional Translators in Latin American Literature. And yeah, that has been my passion project for the last few years. Yeah, it's sort of something that I saw sort of developing from the 1990s. There was this like boom of translator characters. Like I would randomly pick up a book and it would have a translator or an interpreter as a protagonist, as a character in the book. And I was like, for me, it was so fun, like seeing my profession represented in literature like that. And I really enjoyed reading those stories. And one of the idea behind my book, though, is that something that I noticed, of course, in my practice, I was always like, oh, translators connect the world, and, we're bridges between cultures, and all of that is certainly true. But in the representation of those translators that I was seeing in literature, all of these translators were like such bad translators. They were doing horrible work, but not because they were using Google Translate, or not because they didn't understand something, or they were just like oblivious to a meaning of a word or something like that. They were being very purposeful for, in the way that they were changing messages or tampering with the language. And so that really caught my eye. Those are things that you would say you would never do in your own practice, right? The idea of like being faithful to the original, like sticking to the words of the author. And so that really got me thinking, like, how come real translators are expected to be faithful and to really represent exactly the words of the author, and then in literature they're being represented completely different? Like, why is that, right? And so
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I'm thinking of that scene in A Heart So White. I'm sure you covered that. So for anyone who doesn't know, there's this great book by Javier Marias, who recently passed away, sadly. But he's a Spanish writer, and the translators start deliberately mistranslate. They're supposed to be translating for these diplomats, and they start deliberately mistranslating in order to kind of seduce one another. I think it's a great scene. But that sort of speaks to what you're talking about, where these translators
exactly
the job.
Exactly. Yes. That's such a great book. I love that. But so in my book, I cover all Latin American books. And it's, I mean, if you like that scene, go read my book, because you'll learn about other scenes exactly like that.
Great.
And there's, they're fun, right? Like, why are they doing this? And the sort of miscommunication and misunderstandings that they create. But for me, it was really trying to sort of uncover some of the expectations behind translation, right? And this idea that translators need to faithfully reproduce the original, right? And when we think of mistranslation, when we read a translation and we're like, this is not such a great translation, what traditionally means is that there's been a change from the original, right? And so let's say the Spanish original says something along the lines of, the sky is full of clouds, or it's a cloudy day, and the translator writes, it's a gray day, right? It's very gray outside. It's a sad, it's a gloomy day. So would you say that is a mistranslation? A lot of people would say yes, because that's not what the original said. The original talked about clouds, right? And then you're saying gray and gloomy, and you're putting all these feelings inside, right? Like, so, and so the first instinct is to say, well, that's not what the author said, right? But translators, that do more than just say exactly the words of the author. There's also interpretation. Translation is about reading, right? It's a reading of that source text. So if they say it's a gloomy day, then maybe they're trying to convey feelings. They're going back to a scene. They're maybe compensating for something that comes after. They're foreshadowing. They're doing a lot of other things that might not be there in the original, or that may be implied, or they're like, it's about rewriting the word in English, right? And how someone in English would say, would define, would describe that day. For these characters, though, and talking specifically about Latin American literature and what happens with the representation of translators in fiction, I really think that it has to do with the role translation has played in Latin America, and it was central to the developing of a national identity during the 19th century, and how they were trying, they were sort of importing French literature and French politics to get independence from Spain. And the role that translation even has now in the publishing industry. You walk into any bookstore in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, in any city in Latin America, and half of the books are going to be translations. We have a huge importing culture. Anything that comes out in the US, it will quickly be available in Spanish for us to read. There's a lot of culture of reading translations. Well, that is not the case at all in the US. Only 3% of what gets published every year here is in translation. So the approach is, the expectations vary enormously. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic, translation, particularly when we talk about Latin American literature and culture.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much cultural texture that's involved, right? Because you're not just translating the words, or I guess that's for the translator to decide, do I translate this literally, or do I translate this in a way that a North American audience is going to understand it? So they're trying to read the text and also read their own culture at the same time. So that it raises all these questions.
There's so many things to consider, like, how are we adapting the language? How are we talking about slang? What happens with register? What happens when something is, happening in another time? How is my translation going to age? Who is going to be the new reader, right? So, and that happens with English too. Like, I feel like, for example, even though Latin American literature is really based in the US, we have translators from all over the world. And sometimes I will come across translations that are mostly in British English, right? And that, we forget, like, we're so used to talking about Spanish varieties and how different Spanish is spoken, in Spain, in Latin America, throughout the Latin American continent, right? So, but we also forget that English is not one English, right? And so for me, that's really interesting. And we also really want to represent that in the magazine, in the English side of it, right? And I usually, as translation editor, I usually don't mess with that. Like, if the translator is British and wants to use British English, that is fine with me. But I do remember we had one submission. I don't remember exactly what the story was, but it was a family of Latin American immigrants moving to the US and sort of freshly landing in New York, and some of the cultural shocks. And the translation was in British English, right? The author was from the UK. And so for me, it was so strange. Like, why would a Latin American family landing in New York speak in English this way, right? And so it was sort of like an interesting conversation to have with the translator, because I don't want to mess with her English and the use of her English, but also at the same time, what is that English doing in this particular scenario, in this particular text? So anyway, those are conversations that I really like. And I feel like as a translator, as a translation scholar, I learned so much by, having these conversations with our team. And this is a scenario that I have never thought about. So it was like so great thinking like, wait, why would they say this? Or does it make sense that they speaking this way in the translation? What are we trying to do here with the language? So anyway, that was an interesting case for me.
So what makes a bad translation?
Yeah, I feel like a bad translation would be one that you don't want to read.
Mm.
I feel like the point of translations is connecting and, carrying the message or carrying the literature, especially when we're talking, before you were saying there's a cultural context, and that is so important, right? And so, some people will choose to focus on the style of an author. Some people will remain more faithful to the actual words. Some people will be the message, all that, all those things are certainly part of any translation. And I would say that there are many ways a translation could be good. But I would say a translation is bad certainly when readers don't want to read that, and that can take different shapes and forms. But if the translation is not readable, it's not attractive to readers, and that does not necessarily mean that it's not reader friendly. Like some texts are super challenging to read, and that does not mean the translation is bad, right? But I would say that a translation that readers don't want to read, then that is a bad translation. But there's certainly more ways a translation could be good than they can be bad. Yeah.
Sure. So in terms of submissions to the magazine, do you tend to see a lot of submissions coming from the same areas? And if so, what kind of outreach does the journal do to try to like broaden its scope?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. And, of course, when we talk about Latin American literature, the landscape is not the same. It's definitely not homogeneous in that way. We have like really big publishing industries in Argentina, in Mexico, right? Like centers of publishing. And then we have so many other countries that are producing so many great stuff. And then that does not travel well even within other Latin American countries, right? And so actually that when the magazine started, this was a huge deal for us, because the point of the magazine is not only to present Latin American literature in the US and share all this with English speaking readers, but also for Latin American readers themselves, right? Like we have, before I said that this works as two magazines in one, and we have so many readers that never even realize that the whole magazine is available in English. The magazine is read fully in Spanish because in Latin America, sometimes literature is done by really small publishers, independent publishers who are doing great in their home countries. But then when it comes to sort of crossing borders and exporting their books to other countries, then it's not so easy. So, sometimes in Argentina, even if you are in Argentina, it's really hard to know what's happening in Honduras, what's happening in Paraguay, what's happening in Bolivia, even if those countries are so close to us, right? So this was something that was very important for us. And we usually have a lot of submissions coming from sort of the bigger, literary centers, right? We have a lot of Chilean literature, we have a lot of Colombian literature. And so one of our most recent developments actually was getting teams established throughout the sort of Latin American region. So now we have correspondents working to find out and to sort of either commission or invite people to join us. And so more and more, we're sort of really trying to amplify voices from areas that we had not previously published. So, when we're doing our book reviews, for example, we're trying to be very mindful that it's not all books from Argentina, right? Not all, like half from Argentina, half from Mexico. No, like we're trying to really be mindful about that. And if we see a region that is not being represented in the magazine, we're going to be very active about that and trying to invite authors, do events, do some scouting, see what's out there, and see how we can help them, get more visibility in our digital pages.
So are there kind of overarching trends that you're seeing in submissions, like sort of overarching concerns among Latin American writers?
Oh, that's such a good question. I would say that we are certainly seeing trends. Sometimes it's really hard to know if those trends are being sort of pushed by the market, sometimes or sort of prepackaged for a certain audience. I know there's a lot of talk right now about a new Latin American boom of women writers, and all these new female voices that have been emerging, and they write maybe horror, they write Gothic, right? We have Mónica Ojeda in Ecuador, we have Maria Fernanda Ampuero, we have Schweblin, Mariana Enriquez, right? And there's actually been a lot of pushback against calling this a new boom of Latin American women writers. We've always had great female writers, right? And it's just that they were not getting the visibility or the publicity that they deserve, right? It was all sort of male writers. So it's interesting to see some of the trends that are coming from the market. And then we also have when we request materials for submissions, part of our submission process is a cover letter, right? And so usually translators will write why they got interested in this particular story or this particular author. And something that I love to read in those cover letters that comes up actually pretty often is, this is a Colombian writer writing what you would not expect from a Colombian writer, right? Or this is a Bolivian writer who's defying Bolivian literary traditions. And so I see a lot of that, and that's really refreshing because it's very easy. And I think that this actually has happened a lot with Latin American literature, that you just have this label like magic realism. This is what everyone expects. And if your text does not have magic realism, then it's out. It's not Latin American enough for our audience. So, and I also see that, this is something that translators have such a good eye for. Like I said, they are our best scouts, and they're very in tune with what's happening, and they're seeing new things emerging. And so I also get a lot of sort of writers working against tradition, working against labels. So I mean, it's I think it's kind of like a paradox to call that a trend, but but really sort of working against or like challenging trends, like market trends in a way.
Sure. And what are you looking for specifically in your submissions? Let's say, let's cover the fiction.
Yeah. So we publish really varied materials, right? Because we're working with so many different countries. We're looking for something contemporary. Every now and then we will have a special dossier that, maybe recovers an author that's been forgotten for some reason, or like or is being read in a new way, or we're doing like a 10th anniversary of the death of certain authors, so we'll do a special dossier. But really, we're very much like Latin American literature today. So we're really looking forward to receiving contemporary materials that engage with what's happening now, representing the region currently, with all its complexities. Of course, some of the material will engage with politics, and we will have like very committed authors that are going to be talking about political past or history in Latin America. But we're really looking for something that is of now, and that also has to do with our readership in the US. I would say the demographics here in the US are changing so much in regards to Latin American populations, and we're really interested too in sort of redefining or reconsidering what we think of when we think of Latin America, right? And so if a Latin America, or let's say if an author in the US that comes from Latin America or comes from a Latin American family writing in English, can we consider that Latin American, even if that author is in the US writing in English, born and raised here? So really trying to think about some of the, challenges that we are experiencing now as of, in terms of what a Latin American identity would be. So we're very much interested in that, featuring Latinx writers, Latin American writers in the US that are writing in Spanish, sort of against the sort of the English sort of pressure, right? And so, yeah, something that engages with the now, I would say.
And does the subject matter have to be location? So let's say you have a writer who's a Latin American writer, they live in Chicago and they write a story about their cat. But it is a Latin American writer.
Totally.
It has nothing to
Yeah.
do with place or ethnic identity. Is that still a story that you're interested in?
Yeah, it will have to depend on the story. Not every cat story is a good cat story.
Right.
But certainly it does not have to necessarily engage with those topics. But like I said, we publish a lot of different kinds of literatures, and sometimes people think a story is really good. Like, of course, literary quality is one of our top priorities, right? And so sometimes we'll think the story is really good, but maybe does not fit some of the other stories that we already for the next issue. So we will definitely save it and try to sort of pair it with others that either speak of the same topic or resemble each other in some way. And so, for instance, we will have a dossier on sci-fi literature in Latin America, right? Or we would have a dossier on writers who are writing in a second language, for example, right? So we will also do thematic issues like that. And certainly we accept ideas for future dossiers. So if you're a scholar or a translator working with a specific theme and you'd like to propose a dossier that you'd like to collaborate or contribute to us, that would be amazing too. So, you're seeing like a pattern, let's say, like, I don't know, like stories about music in Latin America. Well, we would love to maybe do something specific about that. So it's not like one story about music in one issue, but like really showing that, this might be of interest, or showing, 3-5 stories from different countries that engage with the specific topic of music, in this case, in a particular way. So there's certainly a lot of room for showcasing the diversity of everything that's being created.
Sure. And what are some common reasons for a piece to be rejected?
I would say the time period is a big one. Not because we don't accept, let's say, older materials, but that, older materials that are not presented to us with a new perspective, right? So, like I said, we're very interested in revisiting dead authors, forgotten authors, older authors, more canonical authors, but we want it in a new way. We want a new take. So that is a big one. Also, sometimes, even though I feel like the name of our magazine is pretty clear as to the type of literature that we publish, sometimes we'll have a great submission like, this is so current, this speaks to what's in the news, like right now we have this great, sort of Egyptian author working in Luxembourg with a French translation. And I'm like, that sounds amazing. Like, I love all that network and about the world and like authors moving, but how does this connect to Latin America again? So sometimes, we have like really great submissions, but we really want, we are called Latin American literature today. So that I feel like that's a big one.
Sure. And how do you connect with your audience? Like who do you envision your audience being? And I guess sort of, are you like a lot of magazines get readers through AWP and sort of those kind of professional conferences. But do you have like a different audience, a different way of reaching them? Or are you sort of part of that literary magazine scene?
Yeah. So, it's been wonderful. We are a pretty young magazine, and it's been wonderful to see how much it has been growing in the past few years, especially. We won a really prestigious prize in 2021, the Whiting Foundation Prize
Mhm.
for literary magazines in the digital category. And, that was like certainly a huge boost for us that allowed us also to revamp our website and do it more reader friendly, user friendly. And I would say social media is also great. It's very mouth to mouth, I would say. And every time an issue comes out, it's great to see the translators posting their work, the authors posting their work, or readers posting their favorite stories. So I think it really gets a lot of traction from social media. um we I feel like our audience, because we have so many students working with us, they're great also about telling their friends. And it's sort of like a very fresh audience too, and I feel like they share our excitement for the project, right? Like, for many years, and even now, we're all volunteers at the magazine, so this has really been the labor of love. That we really believe in our mission, and we really want to become that bridge between Latin America and the US, and readers elsewhere too. And so I feel like there's a lot of excitement about that. So a lot of people recommending our stories, inviting others to participate. And so far that's what we have been doing and what we have found successful, I would say.
And is there anything in particular that you want to see more of in submissions, either submissions related to a specific place, specific population, subject matter?
Yeah, I feel like, we try to, like I said before, focus or be mindful about some of the regions that we cover. I think we can do more work when it comes to the Caribbean region, and especially for translation, it's so rich in terms of the variety of languages that are being spoken there. So that is something that we definitely want to see more of. We have had a very robust section related to indigenous literature, and that has been such a joy to see grow too. Because in a way it works as an archive of what's been done too, but there's also so much room for innovation, and we're seeing all the different ways in which indigenous populations across the region are sort of innovating in the language and in literary genres. Particularly for sort of my own interest, and also because I think translation is so key to the magazine, I would like to see more critical reflections from translators. I feel like translators are so mindful of the work of the way that they think through their work, and I want to see more of that. Lately, I've been noticing a lot of books that are being published in translation will also have a translator's note at the beginning, a foreword, an afterword, and I love reading those. Those are my favorite, because you really get sort of a sense of everything that happened in that process. So many things, every little word that you are reading in translation was so well thought of, right? So I want to know more about that process. So I would like to actually use this opportunity to extend this invitation to all working translators are out there. If they are having a book out, and they didn't get a chance to write a translator's note, I would be so interested in reading that, potentially publishing that in the magazine. I would like more critical reflections of their work. Something that we've been publishing lately also, where author translator conversations, because we have, as translators, we usually have a really healthy back and forth with our authors, right? Like, what did you mean here? Or am I understanding this correctly? Or what do you think of this option? So I would like to see more of that too. So I would love to publish more of those conversations. So yeah, I really want our sort of on translation section to grow and get more submissions for that.
That's great. And I see someone had their hand raised. Eunice, did you want to ask a question?
Oh no, I was just clapping.
Oh,
And
Thank
I
you.
almost clapped again just now because of her remarks on translator's notes. So I was just clapping, and I'll also take this chance to apologize for arriving late.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thanks. So a question I ask all editors is, so you have a lot going on. You just had a baby, that, a handful into itself. What keeps you what keeps you invested in the work? What keeps you excited about the magazine? It does sound like you are like really invested and very excited about it. So what, how do you balance running a literary magazine, working in a literary magazine with all your other life demands?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what I do revolves around translation. My full-time job is as a college professor, and I teach Latin American literature and translation studies. So it's still very much part of that. And so, for example, last spring semester at Lake Forest College, I taught a literary translation workshop. And we workshop different types of genres, and I had like a very small group of amazing, super engaged students that really wanted to get sort of their hands on translating. And our final project was actually translating collaboratively poems from an Argentinian poet that were actually later published in the magazine. So I really wanted to work with this author, Valeria Miles, and then work with my students doing that. So, I feel like one of the great things about Latin American literature today is that because it's so young, and because we want to do so many new things too, there's room for that. I know George Henson, who of course still is very much part of the magazine. He was the first translation editor, and he works with his students a lot too. They translated a lot of the book reviews that we publish. So I would say that I try my best to not have like different identities, like my literary work or like my scholarly work, my professor work, my LALT work. But they I feel like they're all sort of part of the same. And we have just an amazing team. I'm really lucky to be working with everyone who's involved in the magazine. I'm really lucky that they invited me on board in 2019. I'm so happy to be part of the group. And part of what keeps us going and keeps us engaged is that we know that there's so much still to be done. We are just getting started. And so we have so many ideas, so many projects that we want to do. And so, yeah, I feel like there's only room for improvement and growth from now on. So that I feel like that's really exciting.
That's great. And are you ever open for volunteers, readers, people who want to get involved in the magazine?
Yes, absolutely. We have a huge translators directory. So if you are a translator, if you are a student who wants to get more experience translating, feel free to get in touch. Send me your CV, send me some samples, and I'd be happy to add you to our translators directory for some commissioned work later on, maybe an essay, maybe a book review, maybe an interview. Make sure that you mention some of the things that you are personally interested in. So for instance, I will get an email from someone saying, I'm really interested in Colombian literature. So if I have a Colombian book review that needs translation, I will pair them with that. So we really want the magazine to be useful for them and their careers and their interests too. So definitely, if you want to get involved, if you want to pitch an idea, pitch a dossier, feel free to reach out to me or to anyone in the team. And we'll be happy to consider that, to sort of, have a conversation about it.
That's great. And what is your submission schedule? And are you open now for submissions?
Yeah, we have rolling submissions. We publish 4 times a year, so we're pretty flexible. Sometimes, we have a little bit of a backlog for poetry now, so we've had some delays there, but usually we try to be as quick as we can in terms of the reviews process. We don't want to leave translators, authors just hanging there. Personally, I always reply my emails. So if you don't hear from me, something happened to your email, I did not get it. I might say thank you for your submission. I will contact you shortly, but I just want to make sure that you know that I got your piece. I'm a translator too, so I submit to journals too, to magazines too. So I know it's very annoying when you just, you click on submittable and then it's lost forever. You don't know what happens to it afterwards. So we make a point of replying, and sometimes we'll be like, this might take a couple of months, but we'll get back to you. We always contact you back for yes or no. And we have rolling submissions, so you can submit to us at any point, and when the piece, if the piece gets approved, we will let you know more likely when that's coming out, what issue and why.
Well, that all sounds super. Thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about the magazine. I love your passion and your energy for it. It's all great and all impressive too, like in the context of having a newborn and all this other stuff going on. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for your questions. I love talking about this. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for coming out, everyone. My pleasure. Thank you.